The rise and fall of Nazi Germany represent a pivotal chapter in 20th century history, characterized by aggressive territorial expansion, ideological extremism, and systemic governance flaws. Under Adolf Hitler's leadership, Germany pursued a vision of a racially homogeneous empire, driven by the concept of Lebensraum, living space, and a hierarchical racial ideology. This essay examines Nazi Germany's territorial ambitions, the strategic and diplomatic maneuvers that facilitated early successes, the ideological perceptions shaping its policies, and the structural deficiencies of National Socialism, particularly its lack of leadership transition mechanisms. By analyzing Germany's actions in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and beyond, alongside its relationships with other powers and the internal dynamics of its governance, this essay elucidates the interconnected factors that led to Germany's catastrophic defeat in 1945. Territorial ambitions and strategic execution. Nazi Germany's expansionist agenda was rooted in Hitler's vision of a Greater Germany, an empire encompassing historically German territories and vast eastern lands for colonization. The concept of Lebensraum prioritized acquiring fertile regions in Eastern Europe, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, and Western Russia, to secure resources and space for German settlers. Hitler justified these ambitions by claiming historical ties to areas such as the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, with its significant ethnic German population, and the Polish corridor, Danzig, Upper Silesia, and Posen, which had been part of the German Empire before the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Beyond these regions, Hitler targeted non-German territories like Ukraine and Russia for their agricultural and strategic value, envisioning a German-dominated empire stretching toward Finland. Germany's early territorial gains relied on a blend of diplomacy and military coercion. The annexation of Austria in 1938, known as the Anschluss, and the Sudetenland in 1938 via the Munich Agreement demonstrated the effectiveness of exploiting ethnic German populations and Western appeasement policies. The United Kingdom and France, wary of another war, permitted these annexations, hoping to satisfy Hitler's demands. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939 with the Soviet Union temporarily neutralized Soviet opposition, enabling Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939. This act, executed with blitzkrieg tactics combining air and ground forces, triggered declarations of war from the UK and France, marking the limits of appeasement. Germany's rapid conquest of France in 1940 and the aerial battle of Britain in 1940 aimed to neutralize Western opposition, but the failure to secure air superiority over the UK prevented a planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, represented a critical escalation. Driven by ideological hatred of communism and the racial inferiority ascribed to Slavs, Hitler sought to conquer vast eastern territories, including Moscow and Ukraine, while displacing or eliminating local populations. This over-ambitious campaign, coupled with Germany's declaration of war on the United States in December 1941 following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, overstretched German resources across multiple fronts. The United States' industrial support through Lend-Lease and its direct military involvement, particularly in the D-Day invasion of 1944, bolstered Allied efforts, contributing to Germany's defeat in 1945. Germany's ventures in North Africa from 1940 to 1943, supporting Italy's failing campaign to control the Suez Canal and secure oil resources, further strained resources, ending in defeat at El Alamein in 1942. Ideological perceptions and international relations. Nazi ideology profoundly shaped Germany's territorial ambitions and its interactions with other nations. The regime's racial hierarchy placed Aryan Germans at the apex, with other groups ranked according to perceived racial purity. Slavs, including Poles, Czechs, and Russians, were deemed untermenschen, subhumans, destined for displacement, enslavement, or extermination to clear space for German settlers. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, the Nazis implemented policies of ethnic cleansing, forced labor, and mass killings to achieve Lebensraum. Jews, viewed as a distinct existential threat, faced systematic genocide, separate from the treatment of Slavs, who were targeted for their ethnic identity rather than alleged Jewish ancestry. The Nazis aimed to expel or eliminate Slavic populations, with no specific relocation plan to regions like Russia or Romania, prioritizing German colonization over organized displacement. Germany's perceptions of other European powers were similarly ideological. The French and British were considered racially acceptable as Aryan or Nordic, but were strategic rivals. France was seen as partly degenerate due to cultural influences, while the UK was respected as a rival despite shared racial traits. Italy, under Mussolini, was a key ally in the Axis Pact of 1936, valued for shared fascist goals rather than racial equality, as Italians were deemed inferior to Germanic Aryans. Germany intervened in Italy in 1943 after Mussolini's fall, not to annex but to secure control. Spain, under Franco, was a sympathetic fascist regime, supported by Germany during the Spanish Civil War, but remained neutral, seen as secondary to Nazi goals. The Soviet Union, with its Slavic population and Bolshevik government, was a primary target, despised for both racial and ideological reasons, with communism equated to a Jewish conspiracy in Nazi propaganda. Alternative strategies and missed opportunities. Germany's early successes raised the possibility of achieving territorial goals through slower, more calculated expansion, leveraging diplomacy and the threat of military force. A restrained approach, focusing on historically German areas like Austria, the Sudetenland, and parts of Poland, could have maximized gains while minimizing global backlash. By exploiting appeasement, maintaining the Soviet Pact, and avoiding provocation of the United States, Germany might have consolidated control over Western Europe without triggering a multi-front war. Economic incentives, propaganda about ethnic Germans, and the threat of a growing military could have coerced smaller nations into compliance, as seen in Czechoslovakia. However, Hitler's ideological drive for rapid Lebensraum and racial purification clashed with such pragmatism, making restraint unlikely. A slower expansion might have delayed UK and French intervention, as their declarations of war in 1939 were tied to Poland's invasion. Avoiding the Soviet invasion in 1941 would have conserved resources, while diplomatic neutrality with the United States could have limited American support to the Allies. However, the full Lebensraum vision, encompassing Ukraine and Russia, was less feasible without war, as these regions lacked German populations and were under Soviet influence. Local resistance, Soviet ambitions, and eventual global opposition would likely have challenged Germany's hegemony, even with a gradual approach. The regime's racial policies, including the expulsion of non-Germans, would have fueled insurgencies, complicating long-term control. Structural flaws of National Socialism. The National Socialist system, or Nazism, was a top-down, authoritarian governance model tailored to Germany's post-World War I crises. Economic hardship, Versailles Treaty resentment, and political instability. Centered on the Führerprinzip, leader principle, it vested absolute authority in Hitler, with no institutional checks or formal leadership transition mechanism. Early successes, such as economic recovery and territorial gains, masked these flaws, but Hitler's unchecked power led to catastrophic decisions, including the Soviet invasion, US declaration of war, and genocidal policies. The system's reliance on a single leader, coupled with its cult-like devotion to Hitler, made it vulnerable to his errors and indifferent to post-leadership continuity. National Socialism lacked a succession plan or process to replace the leader. Figures like Hermann Göring or Heinrich Himmler were named as potential successors, but their roles were symbolic, with no authority to challenge Hitler. The regime's suppression of dissent, through purges like the Night of the Long Knives in 1934 and Gestapo repression, eliminated opposition, ensuring loyalty over competence. Hitler's fatalistic outlook, evident in his refusal to plan for succession and his destructive orders late in the war, suggested he prioritized his vision's maximum extent over Germany's future. This cult leader dynamic, where the system's identity was tied to Hitler's charisma, rendered National Socialism unsustainable beyond his lifetime. A more stable governance model would have required institutional reforms, such as a trusted council of senior party members to manage succession or a designated successor with oversight. A party-based selection process, prioritizing ideological loyalty, could have ensured continuity, but such mechanisms risked creating rival power centers, which Hitler avoided. Comparative fascist systems, like Italy's under Mussolini, had limited checks, as seen when the Grand Council of Fascism ousted Mussolini in 1943. Spain's Franco planned his succession, ensuring regime continuity. National Socialism's extreme centralization, however, rejected such flexibility, tying its fate to Hitler's survival. Conclusion. Nazi Germany's expansionist policies and National Socialist governance reflect a complex interplay of ideological ambition, strategic calculation, and systemic failure. The regime's early successes in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland demonstrated the potential of diplomacy and military coercion, but its overambitious pursuit of Lebensraum in the Soviet Union and reckless engagement with the United States led to a multi-front war it could not sustain. Ideologically driven perceptions of Slavs, Jews, and other powers shaped Germany's actions, alienating potential allies and fueling resistance. A slower, pragmatic expansion might have secured historically German territories, but the regime's racial and militaristic ideology made restraint impossible. Structurally, National Socialism's reliance on Hitler's absolute leadership, without a transition mechanism, ensured its collapse upon his death. This case underscores the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism and ideological extremism, offering lessons on the fragility of systems dependent on a single leader's vision.